Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Meet the Author event. We are going to meet writer Graham Bullen and present his book, The Quarant. We are delighted to have Graham here. Welcome, Graham.
Thank you very much, and nice to be here.
Before we actually start, and thank you very much to all of you for joining us this evening, David, who is going to interview Graham with me, is going to show us a very short video, just about a couple of minutes, with some views of Venice, because some of you may know already the book is set in Venice. Thank you very much, David, for these beautiful images of Venice. It was really nice to see them, and welcome again to Graham. I just wanted to congratulate you to for the publication of this fantastic novel. Really, we thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and it's such a gripping story. We couldn't really put it down until the end. So can you tell us, how did you decide to write a historic novel?
Well, I guess I can answer that in two parts, Sandra, really. The first thing is really, why a novel at all? I mean, I've been an avid reader all my life, and I love submerging myself into the worlds that other people create. I guess I could have started out on my first project just looking at doing short stories, but my great love really is to be able to throw myself in the deep end, to really immerse myself and engage with a number of characters for, you know, in a long form, if you like. So the first part of that answer is, well, why a novel? Well, because I love being part of a world and getting completely sunk and lost in it. The historical part was a little bit more complicated in the sense that I was in a process of leaving full-time employment, and I've had the sort of head that can only hold one thing at once. And because I had the world full of work, I needed something to push all of that out of my head to replace it with. And I thought of no better reason, or no better opportunity than to investigate and research a part of history that I knew, frankly, very little about. It would be a nice project for me. It would be a nice way of cutting my way away from work and entering the next phase. So having sort of harbored ambitions to write for the last 35 years, but having allowed the real world to get in the way of that, I thought, well, now's the chance to do it. And let's come up with a period that's really going to interest me and help, you know, give me the stimulation that I really wanted to learn about a completely different subject to which I was used to.
Well, and you have done it beautifully.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. Can you tell us why did you set the story in Venice in 1348, which interestingly was the time of the Black Death?
Yeah, there's a bit of an answer in that question, David. I guess there was two real drivers. The first one was about 2016. I don't know if anyone else has watched it since, but there was a short series of documentaries called Italy's Hidden Cities that was broadcast in the UK. It was co-hosted by Professor Michael Scott and Alexander Armstrong, the comic who presents Pointless at tea time every night. And they'd enlisted the involvement of some really interesting people who'd got hold of some archaeological technology that allowed them to do some really fantastic imaging of landscapes and of constructed environments. And the three episodes were focused on Florence. So they looked at how the Duomo was constructed by getting basically digital imagery that showed how it was built. They also went to Naples to look at the royal caves that sat behind the palace there, that were to some degree an escape route if there was any incursions into the palace in the past. And then the third and final show was about Venice, and they looked at the buildings along the Grand Canal with this new technology, and were able to show some fascinating architectural insights into both how the houses were built, how there were secret passageways between houses, the degree to which the canals, you know, how the canals were constructed, and how they still hold well together today, and lots of sort of secret nooks and crannies that the average tourist or even the occupant of Venice might be less familiar with. So that was really stimulating and came at just the right time. And then I guess the other part of the question about why Venice, I'd spent a few years working for Shell in Shell in London, working for their trading and shipping company. And as part of that, I spent about a year and a half working with a lot of ship's captains to design and implement a new management system for their global fleet. So I got exposed to quite a lot of maritime law, just the personalities of sea captains, etc. And I found the world fascinating because in a lot of senses, the world of how you control maritime trade and how you document it, how the regulations work, they haven't changed fundamentally for centuries. So a lot of the technology that they use was still very, very oldie worldy. Was, you know, a lot of the language even was very ancient. And when I got to the end of 2016 and had the opportunity to start to write full time, these two ideas came together because, of course, Venice had a very powerful and long-lasting maritime empire with well-established trade routes from, covering all of the Adriatic, the Eastern Mediterranean, and then further east past Constantinople into the Black Sea. So it just felt that thing sort of hung together as a potential area to write about. The 1348 bit was a slightly different question, which I'll come on to, but because I had to really I searched long and hard for a sweet spot in which to position the book. I mean, as you can see from the map, the island or the mainland of Venice Island is fairly tightly packed. At the time of mid 14th century, there was about 100,000 population, so quite a densely packed. I think it was the most densely packed city in the known world at that point. And of course, there's even today there's a real romantic, mystical air to the place, whether you're there as a visitor or you watch films that are based there. So it already had a certain allure for me. But when I looked at the material on the web, it was quite clear that very, very little material or very little literature had been based pre-Renaissance. Most of our views as consumers of history are and views of the city are very much based on what we see today when we watch images of it, photographs, or visit, if we're lucky enough to visit. And it started to feel that there was a different kind of Venice that sat underneath the existing one that would be worthy of investigation. For example, if I just pause for a moment, most of the novel, if not all of the novel of the current tense of the novel, happens within these areas of the Venice mainland. Once we arrive at Venice in chapter 1, we don't leave. So we've got a really tight environment in which the plot plays out across the 6 main districts or sestiers of the mainland of Venice, and the 2 associated islands of the Lido, which is just down in the bottom right-hand corner of the map there, and Murano just to the north. But it didn't. Although the actual street layouts of the mainland of Venice was broadly the same then as it is now, a lot of other parameters, how you would see the city at that time, would be completely different. So St. Mark's Square wasn't paved until about half a century after the book, the period of the book is set. The main waterfront building of the Doge's Palace, which is absolute picture postcard, that only started to be rebuilt in 1340, which is just 8 years before the point at which the novel occurs. So the main quay that's just at the front of that was only built about 6 years before the book opens. The first stone bridge in the city was built in 1170, but the Rialto Bridge, which is one of the archetypical iconic visions of Venice, at that point, while it existed, was completely timber. And in fact, it burnt down in 1310 when there was a failed coup as part of the collateral damage of that coup. So the Rialto Bridge was in at least its second iteration as a wooden structure. It was able to open and close at the top of its structure, but nonetheless, it didn't look at all like it looks like today. That's much more a later Renaissance, post-Renaissance creation. The houses in the city were largely timber, built on large platforms, zatteroni, I think they were called, until later on when they started to use piles to stabilize new buildings. They had thatched roofs. A few of them had slated roofs. Because it was all in wood, no artisan was allowed to have fires or lamps after sundown. They were really worried. They'd had a number of serious city fires that could have really been quite, really quite impactful across the city as a whole. So by 1307, you weren't allowed to have fires or lamps after sundown. And yet, this period, there was a lot of building going on. A lot of the wooden structures were being converted into brick and stone. And Venice itself, the government was making extensive use of brick quarries in the Veneto and on the Italian mainland, particularly up near Padua, and also across the Adriatic in Croatia. The streets themselves, while they weren't paved either, were already being lit by lanterns called sesendeli, and those lanterns were paid for by each parish. And a fire brigade was even established in 1325. So I just wanted to point out that our classic view of Venice now, which is enormously attractive and endearing, doesn't necessarily tie up with the Venice that you should have in your mind when you either read the book or when you think of this late medieval period. So why 1348? Well, I spent about a week or two just building a kind of timeline of Venice that would allow me to at least get some context of that period, maybe running from about 1100 to 1500. But I stumbled across the fact that on the 25th of January 1348, there was a really serious, a really significant earthquake, equivalent to around about the upper sevens, maybe low eights in the Richter scale, that had its epicenter about 70 miles northeast of the city. When that happened, it caused significant structural damage within Venice, and also had the impact of it actually caused the waters to flow out from the canal system, exposing the sides of the canals for the first time in some cases for 100 or 200 years. But as it moved out of the lagoon, it then came back in the form of a tsunami in the manner that we've seen on TV coverage and footage of recent decades ourselves. And that in turn caused more damage. Well, that was happening at the beginning of the year in late January, and by about April 1348, the same year, the Black Death arrived. So you've got these two extraordinarily awful natural disasters happening one on top of the other, all within a very short period of time, in this already extraordinary city that was on the verge of establishing a really, really powerful and long-lasting maritime empire. So I was starting to get quite excited about this particular period. And then what capped it for me was as I looked a little bit further across the whole of Europe, obviously being English myself and wanting to perhaps consider an English protagonist, I discovered also that in the 1340s, the English crown under Edward III pretty much had gone bankrupt. The crown had spent enormous amounts of money fighting the Scots at the beginning of that century, and had already begun to expand its ambitions to take over the throne of France. And in doing so, they'd had an even stronger run on the treasury holdings of coin. And to the point where in 1343, Edward III reneged on all his debts. Now, that had a number of impacts, but particularly it caused the crash, it caused the Florence bankers, who were effectively running the world finance system at the time, two particular families, the Peruzzi and the Bardi, based in Florence. They both went bust within 3 years of each other. The Peruzzi immediately, and the Bardi 3 years later. So by 1346, the world monetary system, or European monetary system, it's probably fairer to say, was in complete chaos. And in fact, it brought a major recession into Europe. So when you look at those factors, with all that drama of economic recession, natural disasters, pandemics, we weren't used to that word when I started to write the book, but we sure as hell are now, of course. Along with all of the political destabilization that can occur during that period, with those factors in place, I genuinely felt if I can't find a way to position something dramatic and meaningful within that context, then I don't really have any right to try, bluntly. So I started to delve from that point onwards. I'd nailed it as 1348 was the sweet spot, and started to delve into the period from about 1300 onwards to see if I could find all of the other subsidiary backstory that would allow me to construct such a drama. Long answer to a short question, David.
Thank you. Excellent answer.
Thank you, Graham. The book title is The Quarant. Yeah. So why did you choose this title? I can see some of our viewers have the book already. And
wonderful.
For whoever want to buy it, of course, they can find it on Amazon and also through your website. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, there's links on there. Thank you very much for the plug. So early in the evening as well, Sandra. Excellent. Let's not do it again for at least another half an hour. Yeah, so why did I come up with the title? Well, again, to give a little bit of background, Venice at this time really recognized the importance and the centrality of trade, and in particular maritime trade, to their aspirations to extend and stabilize their empire further down the Adriatic and beyond, and to set up some realistic competition to other Italian city-states, particularly those that had very strong maritime presence like Genoa. So they'd already been increasing or exercising tighter and tighter controls over imports and exports. And by the time that the book is set, they'd instigated a practice whereby every ship that arrives into the lagoon would be inspected initially upon its arrival. Thanks for the slide, Ken, I'll come on to that. Would be inspected initially when it arrived in dock, and then it would be required to offload its cargo, not straight to the people that were purchasing the items, but into a prescribed warehouse for a period of 40 days. So, in Italian, Quarant, 40. That's where the original label comes from. And during that period, while the cargo itself is in a kind of quarantine of its own, the ship that carried the cargo must also wait in port in the event that there's any problems. They're not allowed to just leave. Now, the customs house, which Ken's just put up on the slide there, although it didn't look like that at the time, the custom house was almost certainly a timber building at that period, but it sat in exactly the same place as it sits today. It's a very prominent position on the eastern tip of Dusodoro, one of the 6 sestiers of Venice. It's almost directly opposite St. Mark's Square and the Doge's Palace, in fact. You'll almost certainly recognize it from any other postcard views of the city. And it sits right at the head of where the Grand Canal opens out and meets the Giudica Canal, and then forwards or to the east to the lagoon itself. So it's very prominently positioned, and you can only imagine that was a deliberate ploy to really show just how important, the level of importance that the Venetian authorities placed on making sure that everything that came in and out of the port of Venice was adequately controlled. So over that period, lots of further checks would be conducted during this 40-day period, not just by the officials of the customs house, but also by tax inspectors to make sure that everything was in order. Now, taxes in the city were actually quite high for anyone other than people who enjoyed citizenship. So if you were a citizen, you got sort of a local tax. If you were a foreigner, someone from outside the city, or hadn't lived in the city long enough to attract citizenship status, then you would be obliged to pay these other taxes, and they were for things like the permission to be able to anchor your ship, to be able to get the uses of the publicly operated wharf sides, to raise a bond that would protect both you and the buyers and the city from any defaulting of deals should that occur within the 40-day period. Even if you were just bringing your ship in to temporarily berth and then leave again without dropping off your goods, there would even be a transit tax. So the Venetian authorities were very, very good at ensuring that they were able to cream as much off the top from international trade as possible. And actually, there was never any concerns voiced of any significance by those people subject to these controls, because what it actually did in practice was guarantee that you were able to do your business in a really robust, stable, and reliable economic environment that was able to continue year in, year out, and and enjoy a very good level, a very helpful level of control and bureaucracy. So this was all happening during this period. It was a practice that had been ongoing for at least 60 or 70 years up to the point of the book's commencement. And it made sure that all contractual requirements were met. So it increased confidence in the market. So the 40 days itself has its origins in religious practice, of course, with the period of Lent and with Christ in the desert, etc. And it was, of course, after the first wave of the Black Death came into Venice, the city was unfortunately inflicted with subsequent waves. We talk about lockdown 1, lockdown 2, and so on with COVID, don't we? These incursions of plague would really come back into the city, probably at least once every 7 or 8 years, sometimes more frequently, sometimes with a bit of a gap. So it took them a while, but to be fair to the Venetians, they were the first people who decided to extend their practice of quarantining goods and apply it to quarantining of new arrivals of people that come into the city. So they utilized one of the smaller outlying islands. I mean, what is there, 120 islands in the lagoon, something in that region? So they had plenty of opportunity to find and use relatively remote areas while still within their control. So they would designate a particular island, and that was where everyone had to go. Imagine a little bit like Ellis Island in New York, where everyone was processed. But they would keep people on this island for a period of 40 days to make sure that when they came into the city, there was little or limited chance that they were bringing the plague with them. Hence the word Quadrant, hence the word quarantine. Most of you probably already knew that, so forgive me if I've taught you to suck eggs, but I think that's, so when I wrote the book, there was no such thing as a global pandemic of COVID-19. It just happened that by the book was published last October, and we were heavily into, we just come out of the first national lockdown in the UK. So in some ways it was quite fortunate that coincided with it. In other ways, of course, with a book that dealt with the Black Death, those of us that were already weary from our current ailments in the UK, I imagine that would have probably put a few people off, because you don't really want to read about misery of others when you're suffering it yourself, do you? But that was how the title came up. And of course, I then, and this was my wife's prompting actually, so I've got Joanne to thank for this. She said, well, the Quadrant is 40 days. There's around about 40 days between the earthquake and tidal wave and the Black Death arriving. Why not set a ticking clock? Why not structure the book so that you've got a chapter equals a day and you've got 40 chapters, and crank the tension in that manner? And that didn't sound like a half bad idea. And by the time I'd thought about it for about 3 seconds, I wholeheartedly agreed with it. And that was where the title came from.
Excellent, thank you.
So the plot revolves around the main character, Malin, and the organisation of a coup to subvert the government of Venice. At that time, Venice was one of the most powerful maritime trading centres in Europe. Can you tell us something about the story without revealing too much, because we kind of would like people to read the book? But yeah, if you give us a little bit of an insight into the story, Graham, that would be good.
Yeah, so 2 years before the story opens, the planning of this coup by the English authorities commenced. So local advisors in Westminster have gained the King's support for a plan to find ways to regain their wealth. I mean, I looked at the, just as an aside, I was of the few primary sources I was able to use for my research, I was lucky enough at Glasgow University to be able to look at the actual treasury rolls of the English crown during this period. And I was quite shocked about just how much money was flowing out of their coffers. So my naive assumption was that the king would be getting money in from the nobles will be getting money in from the church, etc. But because of the state of the nation at that time and the slightly tenuous grip on power that Edward III had, he was paying out thousands of florins a week or month just to sort of almost bribe his nobles to keep their loyalty. It was quite shocking to see. And anyway, the idea is that they're bankrupt. They're going to try and find ways to make money. There's a secret pact with Genoa, who are Venice's arch rivals. I think I mentioned them a moment or two ago. And Genoa will work with the English crown. They will provide the funds for the coup. England will make it happen. And the intention is that England will install a government friendly to Genoa in Venice, and in return, Genoa will grant lucrative trading rights to England. So we have an English trader who's been living in Venice, Malin. He's been living in Venice for about 15 to 20 years. He's, against his will, he's recruited into the ranks of the conspirators. He's pulled back to Westminster, and over a period of 2 years, he becomes the key link between the conspiracy in London and those that are present in Venice who are going to make this coup happen. So basically, he is having his connections that he's built for years in his business. They're going to be exploited by the English crown to make sure that everybody who is needed to make this a success is recruited and forced to participate. And of course, Malin is then conflicted because a lot of the people that he's having to drag into this are close friends of his, people he trusts, people who trust him. And that sets up a lot of the tension. When he arrives in the lagoon on the first day of the book, he arrives the very next day after the tsunamis hit. And of course, in his mind, apart from asking himself, are all my friends safe? He's wondering straight away, does this chaos make it more or less likely that the coup will succeed? You know, is the chaos that will be caused to the Venetian authorities greater than or less than the chaos it will cause their conspiracy and all their plans to make sure that this can happen within a 40-day period? He's using the current as cover. So he arrives in this ship, all his goods are put into the warehouse, as I described earlier, and he is using the fact that he would normally have to crisscross the city to make all of these administrative, bureaucratic and commercial agreements regarding his cargo. He is using that as cover to allow him to move across the city to work with his co-conspirators and finalize the final days of the coup before it actually happens. The other little tweak in there is that while he's been sailing back from London, Westminster has been told by one of Edward's spies who's still in Venice that they've come to suspect that the Venetian secret police have started to mobilize on the grounds that they believe that they've discovered a potential coup. But of course, the message doesn't get back to England before Malin leaves England to come through and up the Adriatic in his ship. And he only discovers this when he arrives, I think the second day that he's in the city. So I'm trying to set this balance up where there's a race against time in all sorts of different dimensions, a need for secrecy, a need for execution, and to do so in such a way that neither Malin nor his friends and the people that he loves are unnecessarily put into danger. So that's essentially the high level plot of the book, and we see how that plays out over the 40 days of the current.
And this main character, Malin Le Cordier, who is the second son of the Geoffrey Le Cordier, who is the seventh Earl of Wormegay, which is a place, is it in East Anglia, am I correct?
Yes, it's just southeast of King's Lynn. It was, yeah.
And it still survives as a Motte and Bailey castle?
It's a ruin now, but you can see the outlines of it, and you can see both the castle itself and in fact what does still stand is the estate church, and one of Malin's saviors, if you like, is the vicar of that period, the priest called Gerald, who takes him under his wing. But yeah, the rest of the castle is a ruin now, which gave me a certain amount of latitude when describing the way that the place operated. But it had quite a lot of lands in this state, and of course it's very flat land, and Kingsland itself was also an extraordinarily busy and important English port.
Yeah, and so this character is fascinating, you know, because the book essentially revolves around him. Yeah. So how did you come up with this character?
Okay, so I wasn't quite sure myself until you asked me the question the other day. I think I was definitely searching for a character that would enable me to somehow bridge the world between England and Venice. When I first started to think about the book, I didn't have any of the thriller elements involved in it at all. It was just a character study. But I wanted to investigate the background of that a character that would be able to fulfill this role might have. I imagined that he might have required links to the court in either England or in Venice. He would certainly have to be involved in international maritime trade, not just local trade within East Anglia or up and down the East Coast, for example. And I definitely needed him to make him interesting in his own right, away from any of the demands of any future political plot that I might come up with. So I spent a lot of time working back from 1348, because I'd already picked that point, to think, well, how old would he have to be at that date? Well, he'd have to have had a lot of experience for him to be such a big asset to the English crown and to have formed all of these important links with colleagues and friends in Venice. So I pitched him as being born around about the first decade of the 14th century. So I had his birth date as around about 1307, such that he was middle-aged by the time that the opening pages of the book commence. And I gave him a problematic history with his father. I really wanted to explore how fatherhood works, and in particular to look at the different impacts that either toxic or benign fatherhood, how that plays out with children, not just when they're children, but to understand and witness what the impacts of that could be throughout those children's lives as they grow into adulthood. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that initially, but that was an ambition. I also wanted to have him as a bit of a child prodigy, which wasn't that difficult in a sense, because in those days when life expectancy was that much shorter, most of the business classes, most of the nobility, children were already, particularly boys, were expected to be able to cope with and occupy a fairly adult role by about the age of 12 or 13. So if he was any good at what he then went into at that age, one, that wouldn't be that unusual, but two, if he got very, very good at it, that would attract the attention of others and would give him the opportunity to progress his career. And of course, by finding a number of proxy fathers throughout his life, or they find him, which is very, very good for him, they are able in turn, each of them, to draw out different skills of his and different aspects of his personality. But at the end of the day, he is, I think I've used this phrase with others, he is damaged goods. He is not your squeaky clean hero. He's not an anti-hero, but he's very damaged. He's had a lot of horrible experiences in his life. And you see how those play out, both in terms of his ability to trust people, his reluctance to upset people in case they don't appreciate him or like him anymore. And in many ways, he's quite emotionally stunted. He's failed over the majority of his life to express his feelings, other than in real extremis, when he's in real trouble. And this plays out both in his backstory, but also during the period of the 40 days in Venice. And it takes him a number of days to come clean with his best friend as to what is actually happening with the coup. He's not let him in on it at all initially when he comes into the lagoon. So I was encouraged by those I talked to occasionally, well, regularly, to not make him too squeaky clean. So he's a very human protagonist. He's not without flaws, and we see those confronted as the book progresses.
You talked there about his relationship with his father. I think you described
Yes.
as toxic, which probably is a good description. But there was the counter relationship with Uberto, and that was interesting. Could you tell us a little bit more about that other side of it?
Yeah, so I alluded to his father, or Sandra mentioned Geoffrey. So Malin's mother dies in childbirth. His father blames him. So from day one of his life, he's already up against it. At the age of 6, he's rescued by another, well, the parish priest, if you like, because his father just has abandoned him, and his bullying elder brother is taking full advantage of that, and he worries about his health. Later on in the backstory, his elder brother, who's become a very impressive but nonetheless slightly psychotic soldier, is killed in a domestic battle in the Midlands in England. And at that point, his father cracks and is allegedly wandering around trying to find Malin in order to kill him. So he's smuggled out of the country and goes to Antwerp to work with the traders there. Now, it's shortly after that, after he's built up his reputation as an excellent trader in Antwerp, he is recruited to work in Venice undercover. So the Hanse, which was a kind of it was like a mysterious business organization that had its origins around the Baltic states, a very effective trading organization. They had warehouses and headquarters in a number of European ports, but were quite secretive. Imagine Maersk shipping crossed with the Freemasons. That's kind of the sort of mystery that's involved in them. They commissioned him to start to infiltrate Venetian trade on their behalf, because the Hanse is a banned organization in Venice. The Venetians are very suspicious of their way of working, quite rightly, because they were a serious competitor to the Venetian trade aspirations. And in doing so, his first contact in Venice is the sort of second in command to a man called Uberto da Segna, who becomes an extremely important player in the book. Uberto is he became a citizen, having arrived from modern day Dubrovnik with his young wife. He worked his way up to become an extremely wealthy and successful trader himself and merchant, to the point where not only did he gain his citizenship, but unusually, they appointed him to become a member of the major council. He then fell from grace about 6 years later, and it's this disparity between the way he was able to feel that he'd established his family and the current ignominy that he sits in, where he's been essentially rejected by the great and the good of Venice, despite earning them lots of money. It's this that gives him the motivation to eventually participate in the coup at Malin's urging. So Malin has essentially become an adopted son in that family, which is fantastic for him. It's exactly the kind of influence that he needs. You can see that in the book, that's where he gets real value. But at the same time, he feels guilt at enlisting his friend, particularly as he hasn't told him about Genoa. And secondly, this causes an additional conflict, emotionally speaking, because Malin and Lucia, who is Uberto's eldest daughter, they've been in love for about the last 15 to 20 years, but never told each other that and never done anything about it. And from Malin's perspective, it's largely because he thinks that by declaring his love for Lucia, he's going to somehow disappoint or upset Uberto. So the Uberto character, who has all of these neuroses of his own, while he loves Malin and loves his family and wants to do everything right for him, has inadvertently also become a source of great repression in Malin's life. And of course, all these things play out within the novel, and they kind of intertwine, and it becomes quite a mess.
It is true. I just wanted to ask, of course, the story is very cleverly shaped around this 40 days period, the famous Quarant, and each chapter unfolds, covers one day of this Quarant period. So you have anticipated a little bit at the beginning, but can you tell us a little bit more in detail? How did you shape the story? There is a real sense of anticipation when you read each chapter. I think it was a very clever way to set up the story.
I'm glad it works. Yeah, so given that 40-day ticking clock, and I have to be quite careful even when I talk about clocks, because there was only about 6 clocks in Venice in this period, and none of them had minute hands. So even the handling of time was a little bit problematic. Initially, I was going to write a story that would basically take his entire life chronologically through from birth to this point. But I decided instead to focus on the dramatic unity of Aristotle's dramatic unities, really, of time, place, and theme, and just really focus almost claustrophobically on action that only happened in Venice, but to do so by allowing the reader to, if you like, walk around just behind Malin's shoulder and accompany him as he walks around the city in various directions for various purposes, and learn about what's going on through him. So the reader doesn't get to know any more about what's going on than we are allowed through Malin's eyes. So even when action occurs within the city, if Malin's not present, we only get to hear about it when he hears about it, when friends or colleagues or co-conspirators come and talk to him about it and tell him about what's been going on. So I wanted to create this synergy between the reader and Malin, so that at no point is the reader able to say, oh, we know something that he doesn't. That can be quite constraining as well, so I had to work quite hard to find legitimate scenes, legitimate circumstances in which the transfer of information can feel credible. But I think it works. I mean, the nice thing about doing this for me was it gave me the chance to explore Venice as a character as well. So as Malin wanders around the city, we get to experience the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, the weather, the different sectors, the different sestiers of Venice, because they all have a very distinct, I think, different feel, a different sense of how things work in those areas. So you've got the very densely populated San Marco down to the Rialto. You've got the slightly less populated but nonetheless quite upper class San Polo district, etc. And then you've got the sparsely, almost semi-industrial area of Castello towards the east end of the island, where the Arsenal is. Yeah. But we get to explore the city as well, and meet a whole bunch of secondary characters that I hope both represent the detail of what has to be done during this period, both in terms of the political coup and the business of the day, but also just how does the city tick? What does it feel like? How easy is it to get from one place to another? How long does it take to walk? They only leave the city, the mainland, to go to the Lido a few times because that's where the ship is docked. And secondly, to go up to Murano, where they hope to meet up with the military force that's going to come in and assist them in the coup towards the end of the book. So I wanted the twists and turns to come each day, both in the political plot and how the emotional subplot of the book works, particularly between Malin and Lucia, between Malin and his friend Simon, and between Malin and his quasi foster father Uberto. So that's really how I decided to fix it. I had in my head, I'd recently finished reading a really superb series of detective fiction novels by an American writer called Lawrence Block that was recommended by a friend. And there's about 17 novels featuring this private detective, Matt Scudder. And there's very little violence in his stories. What violence occurs is related off screen, if you like. You don't actually see any of the gratuitous violence, which I quite like the idea of that. But what you see is you explore over the series of books, you really get a feel for New York City. And I wanted my readers to be able to experience Venice through Malin the same way that I experienced New York City through this detective, Matt Scudder. And because I'd only just finished reading this huge series of books that he'd written over about 40-year period with the same character, that had a big influence on how I wanted this to work.
Thank you.
Now, you've clearly, Graham, you've developed quite a significant knowledge of Venetian history and society since you started this project. Mm-hmm. You have quite perceptively put a glossary of words and historical side notes at the end of the book, which is quite useful. I must admit, I referred to it quite a lot. But for the general reader, I think one of the most complicated aspects is the working of the Venetian government.
Yes.
Could you just give us a sort of broad overview of how that Venetian government works or worked at that time?
Yep. I'll just wait for Ken to get that in the slide view. Here we go. Yeah, so yeah, I don't confess to be expert in this by any means, and depending on which sources you read and when they were written, you get a subtly different perspective on how the roles and responsibilities were shared across some of these bodies. But broadly speaking, you've got the Doge at the top of the tree, if you like. I've shown it as an inverted tree in this particular diagram. But the Duke of Venice, that's not a hereditary role, that's an elected role. The individual is elected by the major council upon the death of the predecessor in that position. While he's the person that makes the final decision and signs off, if you like, on any executive decision that has to be taken, normally the decisions themselves are presented to him by his cabinet, the collegio, as it's shown there, which is made up of the 6 senior councillors, each one of which represents one of the 6 sestiers of Venice. So they're the equivalent of the local councillors, or they're like mini mayors, if you like. They are elected by the electorate, the Orengo, to represent their sestier, and those 6 sestiers together are represented in the cabinet, and it's them usually that makes the decision on behalf of the Doge, and then they just ask the Doge to kind of rubber stamp it. It's quite interesting when you look at the list of the Doges of Venice. They are drawn from a relatively limited range of families. You've probably got, I mean, you've got Doges going back to probably the 10th century, and you'll probably only see about 20 or 25 families' surnames coming up as being, you know, the source of these people. Interestingly, the Doge at the time of the book, Andrea Dandolo, he was a relatively young Doge. He had only just been elected, having been a very successful and very young, I think he was 25 when he took the role. He was the procurator of St. Mark's Basilica and had spent an enormous amount of money that he'd raised within the city to do a lot of work within the Basilica, particularly the baptistry, which is an extraordinary room, and for which there's much praise in the book. And there's a really pivotal scene that takes place in the baptistry. But he becomes Doge. Interestingly, he's also gossiped about during the book for having an alleged affair with the wife of the Milanese ambassador, causing the cancellation of an official visit from Milan. and there's lots of gossip about that. And I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but this particular Andrea Dandolo is the last of 4 doges that are drawn from that family. There is never another Dandolo doge, even though he maintained his position for at least another 15, 20 years after the book completes. The way that the doge is elected is extraordinary. There was real concern that the major council, who I'll mention a little bit more in a moment, we'll show some pictures, that the major council was subject to a lot of suspicion of bribery and malpractice. So they created this intricate method by which the election would be held. So, I mean, I only mention this detail not because you need to know it, but because it's just an illustration of how the Venetians came up with answers for everything. So there would be 30 members of the council would be selected by lot. They would then be reduced to 9 by lot as well. Those 9 would then choose another 40 members of the council. Those 40 would be reduced by lot to 12. Those 12 choose 25 more and different councillors. That's then reduced to 9 again. Those 9 choose 45. Those 45 are then reduced by lot to 11. And at that point, those remaining 11 are the 11 that choose the 41 councillors that are actually allowed to vote for the Doge. So you can imagine, if that's just one snapshot of the complexity that they've put in place, with all the right reasons, I'm sure, you can imagine just how powerful and strong the overall bureaucracy is that governed the city by this period. They were really into making sure that their oligarchy, it wasn't a democracy, it was very much an oligarchy, that they had chiseled away at every reason they could think of that could cause rot within the center of the government. So that's the Doge. The Collegio I've mentioned, they're really the cabinet, they're the closest advisors to the Doge. Then there's a minor council of about 40. The number 40 comes up again, yes? We talked about the Quadrant, we talked about the days of Lent. Another example of where the number 40 becomes significant. This is a sort of subset of the major council, so they had extra rights when they gathered together, including they were able to exercise right of appeal. So if there was a legal dispute that the magistracy was handling and one or the other of the appellants weren't happy with the outcome, they could appeal to the minor council to understand, to see whether or not that particular outcome could be overturned or not. I've got a character in the book that is the most senior member of the government that's inside the conspiracy. And he is a member of the minor council and the Collegio. So, you know, being able to have a member of the conspiracy that's high up in the government is a definite advantage to the conspirators. We look briefly across at the Brigadi. They don't play much of a role in the book. They're very much like they're the lawmaking arm of government. They're like the US Senate. Actually, interestingly as well, there wasn't a coherent, integrated law book in Venice until probably around about the 1320s, 1330s. So up until that point, although there was a myriad of municipal regulations, laws that applied across both the city or into their provinces around their maritime empire, it wasn't until quite recently, in terms of when the book commences, that all of these laws were put together in one complete canon. But the Brigadi were then the owners of that body of law, and they were the people responsible for generating future legislation that will be voted on by the major, the minor, the cabinet, and the Doge. The Council of 10, these are the real dark spot of the Republic. The Council of 10 was established as a temporary body in 1310 after an unsuccessful coup. You remember I mentioned the burning of the Rialto Bridge that was wooden? As part of that coup, that happened. But as a response to that coup, which was unsuccessful, the government decided to create a temporary body that would be there to identify and quell any kind of treasonous behaviour, any kind of plans or plots, sedition or treason. As with most of these organisations, as soon as people get the opportunity to be part of them, they start to build up their power to the point that it's very hard to stop them. And in fact, by 1334, not only had they been made a permanent organisation, whereby they would become the primary intelligence and counterintelligence service within the empire, they also became the template for all modern day totalitarian secret police forces. So imagine from the French Revolution onwards, where you had the Commune and the reign of terror, most organizations, and this includes the CIA, this includes the Russian KGB, etc., all created, and I suppose you could probably throw MI5, MI6 in this to a degree, but they all created organizations that were based primarily on the template of this organization. So the Council of 10 employed numerous, hundreds at times, of informers and spies around the city. They were the official clearinghouse of state intelligence, and when they sat with the Doge and the 6 councillors of the minor council, sorry, of the collegio, the set of the cabinet, they actually had the ability. They carried the same weight as those decrees issued by the major council. And as time went on, I mean, the Venetian government model that you see here probably lasted for about 350 to 400 years. And as time went on, the Council of 10 just became stronger and stronger and stronger, to the point where they could be investigators, arresters, the judiciary of, and sentences of any crime that they chose to take an interest in, up to and include, and they could execute people without any form of appeal at all. In fact, I imagine if you appealed against a judgment by the 10, you'd probably end up being a guest in one of their prisons pretty close afterwards. They were that powerful. If I don't know if you can go back, Ken, can you go back to the cover photograph for a moment? He's doing a great job. Thank you, Ken. So the image on the front there it's not no accident that it's made its way to the front cover. The Doge's palace featured numerous mail slots or mailboxes that were built into the sides of the palace and inside some of the rooms inside the building in the shape of a lion's mouth, which is what you see here, an example of that. There are a few still existing around the palace, and they were called the lion's mouths, and were marked for secret denunciations. So if you wanted to anonymously provide a tip-off to the 10, you needed to do little more than put in an anonymous note and post it through the mouth of one of these sculptures. And they feature very heavily in the book as well. So that, sorry, thank you, Ken, for doing that. Could we go back to the government picture? So that's the Council of 10. Then we have the Major Council. This is by far the largest body that governs the Republic. If we look at so here we can see the actual room in which they sat for or convened every Sunday, pretty much, apart from crisis conditions, for about 400, 500 years. Obviously, in 1348, this room was still, I wouldn't say it was under construction, but it certainly didn't have the ornateness, the extraordinary ceilings that you see in these pictures. So this one was drawn from the mid 18th century. But they did, there were so many of them, they did line up and seat themselves in the configuration that you see in the painting in 1348. They were called to sit every Sunday because all of the nobles that were members and you know, member equals noble, noble equals member. It was that much of a given. They would be called to attend every Sunday because they were busy dealing with other matters for the other 6 days of the week, and Venice, being Venice, didn't want to interfere with business any more than they had to. But they were called in to attend by the bell that rung in the main from the main campanile in St. Mark's Square, the really tall tower that we all know about and have as part of our image of the city today. The bell was called the trottera. It was named after the sounds that the trotting horses and mules made as they carried their charges to the Doge's palace to attend each Sunday's meeting. By the late 13th century, which is about 50 years before the book is set, there was a rising fear that the nouveau riche in Venice was starting to have too strong an influence over the matters of state of the city and of the empire itself, the Republic. And as that fear grew amongst vested interests, there were a series of moves to start to restrict new entry into membership of the council, such that by 1297, there was an event that we know of now as the Serrata, or Great Closing. At that point, it was decided that anyone who was going to continue to be a member of the major council would have to demonstrate three continuous generations of family membership of that council in order to still be part of it. So this is them really clamping down and stopping the new guard entering any kind of influential public life. The names of the people who were allowed to continue in role were entered into a thing called the Golden Book, the Libro d'Oro, and that Golden Book, it's a bit like Burke's Peerage in the UK. They maintain that book, that list of authorised membership, again for over 400 years, and it's no coincidence, I think, that having made that kind of restriction, that a number of attempted coups occurred over the following 30 years, usually led by disgruntled, wealthy, excluded members of the upper echelons of Venetian society. So that was quite a powerful closure. It wasn't impossible for people to join, new people. In fact, Uberto was sponsored to become a member about 9-10 years before the book opens. Mm-hmm. But it was very rare.
Thank you, Graham. It's really fascinating. I just wanted to ask you very quickly, and then Ken can show us some other images of Venice where you have placed the characters. You know, each character has a house, or anyway, as a group, they are meeting in different locations to organize this coup. So how did you decide? I mean, we don't have a lot of time left, but how did you decide? How did you choose these locations?
Well, initially it was just as a complete service to the plot. So if I needed some characters to have a meeting and they were in location A over here and location B over here, I would find a location that was central to both of them. For example, if they needed to meet in a church, which one would I pick? Does the location assist in the progression of the plot? So it's very much, and then certainly some locations were more visited than others because they became the favourite haunts of various characters in the book. So yeah, you can see. So that the image there, Ken, that you're showing is Malin and Simon's house at Castello, and a lot of scenes take place either at the small quay side that's just in front of the house, or indeed inside the house. We get to about halfway through the book, and they have a regular daily meeting in Malin's house, actually, to find out what's going on, because things are starting to get a little bit out of hand and they need to keep intelligence going as to what's going on. I stood outside. When I stood outside that house, it was really tempting to knock on the door, because I'd been looking at it on Google for about 2 years at that point, and I really wanted to go inside, but I didn't have the Italian or the courage to do that. Here we're back in Sao Paulo, sorry, and the large yellow building just behind my, what is that, my left shoulder, I imagine to be the Umberto de Segna's family home. They were pretty wealthy. It was the biggest house in the street, and that seemed to work for me. There was no other real reason than that, other than picking the area which is close to but not part of San Marco. So that's where I imagined an aspiring wealthy man would live. Here we are standing back in St. Marco, Sestiere now. I mentioned earlier the senior member of the conspiracy that was on the minor council and the collegio. This is Soranzo's house, and there's a significant number of days when there's a stakeout in this particular Campiello. And here's the fantastic, the astonishing gates to the Arsenale, which was the most extraordinary industrial outfit, if you like. They were pushing out maybe 4, maybe 5 completed galleys a week at its peak. They employed about 10% of the workforce, and Sclavo, one of the key characters, was the head of supply there. And there are a number of scenes, both immediately in the aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami, but after that as well, which are pivotal to the book's progression, that take place within those walls. We were unable to get inside on that one. It's limited access now. And here we are on the Lido. The Church of San Nicolo is important for 2 reasons. One, that the patron saint of seamen is St. Nicholas, and whenever voyages were planned, particularly where there was a complete fleet of ships involved, there would be the necessity for everyone involved to attend this particular church to get the blessing for the voyage itself, and to give it the greatest chance of success. And Umberto, who's a good egg really, he is distinguished from his fellow merchants in that he's one of the few that actually goes back to the church after each successful voyage to give his thanks. Everyone else has gone back to the main island to celebrate. This is a slightly overweight version of me peering into the murky depths of a random canal. In actual fact, there's a scene in the book. This is in Santa Croce, which is quite near Venice's railway station in modern day Venice. It's to the southwest of the city, and there is an episode here that has significant ramifications, whereby Malin is accosted by a potential assassin. So I'm standing there wondering if I can see the remains of said assailant. Needless to say, I found nobody. And then my favourite street, Cal de Stagneri, it's in San Marco. It's a very nondescript street, really. It's very narrow, but I selected it as a key location once I found out that the pub that features there, is it the Devil's, I can't quite see it, the Devil's Forest, claims to be a pub on the site of the oldest ever tavern known in Venice. So I had a pub called it's actually a tavern stroke brothel, features a lot in the book. It's where Malin meets with King Edward's spies, and it's in that street. It's called the Tinsmith, which is just a literal translation of the street name. Yeah, I really like that street actually. Yeah, it's nondescript, but I used it a lot.
Thank you, Graham. I think David has one last question for you, and then we can open it up to the floor.
Yeah, very simple question, Graham. What are you working on now? Is there going to be a sequel to this?
Almost certainly, but I'm not sure whether I'm going to start with a sequel or a prequel. I've not quite made my mind up yet, but one of those will certainly be quite high up on my list. I mean, just preparing for this conversation has re-whetted my appetite, in all honesty. So I think I'm gonna, when I get to pause the piece I'm working on at the moment, I might well start to build a synopsis of what such a book might look like. But there'll definitely be more. There's legs in those characters, both before and after, that I'd really enjoy exploring further.
We'll pencil you in for a future talk then.
That would be nice. although I need to build some extra strength in my vocal cords because I'm starting to lose my voice.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Graham. And that was very, very interesting, fascinating. So if there is anyone who wants to ask now a question to our author, Graham Bullen, you can do so by typing your question in the chat, or if you are, you can do that orderly. You can unmute your microphone, and I can ask one question in the meantime while people are warming up. And can you tell us, I know that you have a secret Italian connection. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, first things first, I'm not sure how much of a secret it is. And secondly, it's not really my connection, it's my wife's connection. Yeah, my in-laws are first generation Italian Scot on my mother-in-law's side. Both sides of her family come from the Bay of Naples area, and we're essentially talking about the family of the Marcellas and the family of the Moroccos. They both came to Aberdeen either shortly before or shortly after the First World War, and of course settled in Aberdeen, as did a number of people at that point in the 20s. And integrated within the Scottish community. So, Joanne's father is from Torry in Aberdeen. Hooray, Torry! And I experienced my first experiences of Italians generally, apart from Italia '90 in the World Cup, was really just going around my in-laws for Easter dinner and being assaulted by various copious amounts of Di Serono and Frank Sinatra and the other crooners over Easter lunch. The Morocco side of the family is directly connected to Alberto Morocco, the painter, which is a source of great pride for Joanne's family that that's the case.
Yes, I know very well as an artist. I mean, of course, I never had the chance to meet him in person, but Alberto Morocco, yes, the painter. I think we have some very nice paintings in the Aberdeen Art Gallery by him, if I'm correct. You have a question from Graham, and he says, you mentioned at the top end of this that you had an ambition to write, but had always been lured away by working life. Did you write poetry or things of that nature to channel the writing desire?
No, I wrote gloriously over-the-top PowerPoint business presentations. And was criticised heavily for my wordy style, which I should have taken as a compliment, I suspect. Although at the time, I obviously inflicted too many words on too many ears. I never really, I basically channeled my thought and ambition into love of story by others. So it was reading other people's work, largely, well, almost exclusively fiction. Most of what I know about the world I've picked up from literature rather than from non-fiction works. So this was a new departure for me. And no, I mean, I've always been the type of person that can only hold a single type of information in my head. So while I was renting it out to my employer for 30 years to store the information in it that my employer required, I genuinely didn't feel that I had the capacity to start pushing other stuff in. That's why I felt so liberated and so grateful when I got the chance to do this.
I've got a question, Graham, from Zoe Mackenzie. She says, who is Malin based on? Is it you? And why are you so interested in him having a talk?
Yes, he's a complete basket case. It's definitely based on me. Now, there are aspects of his life and lifestyle that have some similarities. So he walks around Venice with a really bad stomach. He's probably got hiatus hernia from the battle that he was involved in when he met Simon, and he has these little phials of gentian tea, which was the traditional remedy for a sore stomach in those days. And I suffer from the same, but it's now Gaviscon tablets. And also he's probably a little bit up his own backside on occasions, and I've been known to be like that too, and a little bit insensitive to the feelings of others. I'm not going to say any more about this, or you're all going to immediately log off.
There is another question from Ian, and he says, fabulous speech and a great book. How did you come by the names of the main characters? Are they from the period through research, or name you know or you like? So
I discovered just how many cheat sheets there are on the World Wide Web when I started looking at this. The number of sites that you can go to where you can look up what was the most popular southern Italian male name in the 14th century, what was the most prevalent woman's name in East Anglia at that time. And so I essentially stole and made up names as I went. There's a few real names there, of course, you know, sort of government officials, etc. But all the characters' names I just drew from relatively reputable lists of what were the most frequently used names in those days.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who would like to ask something? This is your last chance before we say goodbye. I think that there are a lot of connections and similarities between, you know, that period and this period. How long did it take you to write the story, and were you aware that, I mean, when you started, of course there wasn't the pandemic, but this book has been prophetic in a way. I mean, how long did you take to write the story? So there wasn't the pandemic yet, am I correct?
Correct, yeah. I started at I went on a few residential writing courses at the Moniac Moor Creative Writing School up on the moors above Loch Ness, which really gave me a solid grounding, and in fact there's some really good friendships amongst fellow writers as well that helped me get through this. But I would say I started writing it in around about September, October 2017, which is well in advance of any pandemic, and completed the first draft just before Christmas the following year. I was really struggling. I did about 80,000 words of backstory and got to the point where I was almost hiding behind that, almost cowardly. So I took the plunge, and then that started to dry up a little bit. I really struggled to get some pace because it was the first long piece of writing I'd ever done, and I was constantly editing, re-editing, triple editing, and often ending a day with less pages, less words than I started with. And then I spoke to a friend of mine. He gave me the necessary momentum in terms of a stern talking to, and told me just to get on with it. And my output then tripled, and I managed to get the rest of the book written before Christmas. And then really the final, I did two further drafts and in the spring of the late winter and the spring of the following year. So yeah, about 14 months in total. But you know, subsequent to that, I've been able to generate material slightly quicker as I've gradually learned a little bit more about how to write and how I write.
Well, it was a mammoth enterprise because there is an awful lot of detail, an awful lot of historic knowledge behind it. So of course, you know, you had to kind of absorb all that knowledge before you were able to make it into the novel.
Yeah, I mean, 50% of what I researched never actually got used, but it gave me the additional confidence that I had that solid, relatively solid, broad basis of knowledge, so that I would at least get the ability to sense if I was going a little bit outside what I really knew. That helped a lot. Of course, now trying to write, I'm writing a book on that's set in 16th century Sicily. All of the interlibrary systems are all closed down because of the pandemic, so I'm having to fly blind. It's not a comfortable thing. So my first draft of the next book is going to be riddled with holes that I'm going to have to retrospectively fill.
we have another question from Anne, and she says, why did you make Simon Scottish?
For the same reason that I had Malin coming from East Anglia. So I hail from North Suffolk. So and Norwich is my spiritual home, really, even though I've never lived there. Come on, the Canaries. But for the same reason, I picked Simon because, you know, my adopted home is Scotland. I've married a Scot, despite everything I was saying earlier about Italian heritage. And I wanted to, you know, I both admire and appreciate the Scots generally and their culture. And I thought that it would make for a really nice contrast, particularly given at the time England was beating up the, you know, I think Frankie Boyle said that it was a period when the English were finding increasingly inventive ways to kill the Scots. I just wanted to have, I mean, the English are Anglo-French actually, so Malin is really French. I wanted to feature both of those to get the personality clashes and compatibilities there, and really just to offer in future an opportunity to place perhaps a sequel that features more of a Scottish setting.
Well, thank you very much, Graham Bullen, for coming here this evening and talk to us about the Quarant. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for staying with us and for taking an interest in our events. We are meeting in 2 weeks' time on the 11th of March, which is again a Thursday, when our Vice President Gavin Bell is going to present the other Norman conquest. So stay with us again in 2 weeks' time. You can learn a little bit more about our next events by looking at our website, aberdeenitaliancircle.org/forward program. And if you want to buy Graham's book, you can look at Amazon and find the book there. Now, don't go away, because I understand that David has a few more images just to close and say goodbye. Thank you, everyone.